Hi, everybody. This is David P. France coming to you from Basel, Switzerland. Before we get this interview started, I'd like you to like the video, subscribe to our YouTube or BitChute channel, share the video to your friends and family. It's David P. France TV. We are a platform for creators and creative people, artists, inventors, thought leaders, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. And today, or tonight, my time, I guess, I have the great pleasure to introduce you guys to someone who I've known for quite some time. How long has it been? Like 30 years plus, easily.
Oh, right? Yeah, it's been over 30 years for sure.
Stacia Crawford. Stacia is in Chicago at the moment. She's based in Chicago, actually, and she is the founder of Stay Ready Media. And Stay Ready Media is a media consultant agency, which she is the founder of. And Stacia is also, you are a producer with one of the television stations in Chicago as well. We'll get into that as we begin our conversation. But first off, tell us what this agency is about. Let's say, I mean, already I can sense that, you know, technically I'm in media as well. So if, you know, I wanted to give you a call and I say, oh, you know, Stacia, I need some help. You know, what could you help us or help me with, rather?
So what I do is really multifaceted. So some people think of my company as a PR agency, but we really do way more than PR. It's way more multifaceted than that. And I like to think of it as PR done differently. Mm-hmm. So because I have a background as a television news producer, I use my media experience to help other people garner media attention for their businesses. So I work with authors, entrepreneurs, coaches, industry leaders who are interested in using the media, meaning television, radio, podcasts, magazines, newspapers, to get exposure for their businesses and their brand and share their knowledge and their expertise.
Mm-hmm. As I looked at the website, there were 3 different areas that I saw. One was media training, the second was crisis communication, and the third was publicity workshop. Now, the thing that I'm interested in is crises. I'm going to pick the second one, crises communication. So what would you do in terms of what kind of service do you offer with regard to crisis communication?
Yeah, well, basically what that is, when you find people who have gotten into some sort of trouble or they're trying to get ahead of some sort of trouble, we help them develop their key messages so that they can get out in front of it and then it doesn't become as big a problem.
Mm-hmm. And also, let's say media training, let's say, what does that entail? Could you describe to us? I mean, let's say, I want media training. Like, what would that be?
Media training is really just getting you ready for your interview. So, you know, basically the 3 steps that we offer, first would be the publicity. So that is helping you develop key messages, identifying outlets, key journalists who will be available to help share your message in the media. But then after you book that media interview, then how do you prepare for that? So the last thing that you want to do is get a television interview and then go, oh, I'll just wing it. You know, whatever they ask me, I'll just come up with something. Because what you're usually going to do is, number one, you'll end up rambling, or you end up missing the key points, or you walk away from the interview saying, wow, I wish they had asked me this, or I didn't get to make the statement that I wanted to make about that. All of that goes into media training. So it's never just open your mouth and whatever comes out. You really want to make sure that you get the most bang for your buck and take advantage of every media opportunity that presents itself. And we do that through media training.
Mm-hmm. And let's say if I want to get on TV, I'm just this random person. And I need to be on TV. Like, I really would like to. Now, just to give you guys a little bit of background, I used to work in television as well, in cable news, right? So I worked at MSNBC as a guest booker. And what my job was is that I was the person that Stacia would have told me, I want you to get so-and-so on the phone, and I would be the one they track that person down. Or Stacia would say to me, We need to find, this is in the role of a producer, because she also is a producer. We need to find, let's give an example. We want to have Hillary Clinton call her office and see whether, no, that's not a good example. I would sometimes suggest to you, like maybe the best person for a specific situation, and then I would call and you would give the approval, and then I would call, right? And then we would get that person on the air. So generally, as I remember, it's very little room for somebody off the street to be able to get on television, because usually it's either you're calling the shot, or somebody else is calling the shot with regard to the.
Right. Well, that's the thing. See, that is one of the myths that I actually help to debunk, because everybody has a story. And a lot of times, most of the people that I work with come to me saying, you know, I feel like I have something, or I have this message, but I'm not really sure how to position it, how to really present it so that it's valuable to someone else. But everybody does have a story. And that means even everyday, ordinary people. Being a producer, one of the things that I get the advantage of being is in those rooms where producers, reporters, journalists, editors are having those meetings about what types of stories they want to do on any given day. And many times there are everyday, ordinary people who can fill those roles. They just don't know it. And so that is part of my role as the PR strategist, instead of just, you know, like some people might say, you know, I'm a PR expert, but it's actually helping you to recognize the value in your story and where you fit in. So everyday people, absolutely.
So we're going to return to that topic, because I'm going to figure out, like, let's say I'll create some sort of person that comes to you, and then you give us an example of maybe what I need to do, or how I would need to be able to either get on television, get out of a crisis, or any other thing that would help me sort of sharpen my my message, right? But tell us more about how you got started, so people know a little bit more than sort of what's going on with your company. How did you get started? Sure. I mean, of course, you and I attended the University of Pennsylvania together. We graduated from the same class, the class of 1989. So I just want to mention a shout out on that. But after that, once you graduated, what happened? Well,
when I graduated, actually, I was in a very rare position, because television is so small. And so a lot of people will start out and say, oh, well, I want to be in TV. But because there are so few opportunities, a lot of people end up doing other things. I actually got an internship my junior year. I was at WCAU, which was Channel 10 in Philly, which is the 4th largest market in the country. So it's like to start out in the 4th market is like unheard of. Most of the time people will tell you, and I got these stories too, oh, you know, you're going to have to go to, you know, Paducah, and you're going to have to go to some little, you know, never heard of town. And I actually started my career in Philadelphia. So when I was a junior, I got an internship, and then that internship is what got me my first job in TV. So I started at Channel 10 in Philly. And then after graduation, I actually went back to Baltimore. My grandmother was very ill at that time, and so I wanted to be back home with her. So fortunately, because I had experience in TV and I had this Penn degree, I got a job in Baltimore as an associate producer. So that was my first job out of college. I worked in Baltimore for about a year and a half, and then I got my first job producing in New Haven. So I went to New Haven, Connecticut, and I worked as a producer there for about a year and a half. And then after that, I got a call from my old station in Baltimore. They were like, hey, we've got a position. Are you interested? I moved back to Baltimore, worked as a producer there for about 3 years. And during my time there, you may remember back in the day when it was like Saturday mornings was like all cartoons. That's all it was. Saturday mornings was for the kids. Well, we were one of the first stations, and I was one of the first producers in the country to actually develop a weekend morning news show. So I did that in Baltimore. And then after about a year, Chicago came calling, and they were like, hey, we saw what you did in Baltimore. We want to start doing weekend news here too, and wanted to know if you could do it. So I picked up and moved to Chicago 25, almost 26 years ago, and I'm still here.
Wow. So just to go back a bit, I mean, when you talk about Saturday was mostly cartoons in the morning, right? At what time did they start the news in Baltimore? What time did this actually?
We were doing our show would go on at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and then we would have news, for like 2-3 hours, and then the kids could have the rest. But yeah, we started doing news on the weekends.
Right. Well, actually, I mean, and I've told you this before. I'm born and raised in Baltimore up to about middle school. So I remember Baltimore had a very strong, if I'm right, and you tell me if I'm right, Baltimore had back then a very strong news, I'm going to say program. Is that the right way to say it? Like there were a lot of people that went through Baltimore.
Yeah,
a lot of people who are now national figures or people working in the bigger positions. And
most famous one being Oprah.
Oprah went for sure. And I think not Carolyn Kennedy.
Carol Sims. Carol Simmons came through Baltimore.
Carol Sims from New York station, right? NBC. Wow. Yep. And then also Maria Shriver, I think, was in Baltimore for a while. That's interesting.
So Baltimore's been a good, good jumping off point for a lot of very long careers.
Right. You're in Chicago for 20 some odd years. And what types of assignments did you start with, and then sort of like give us a development path with regard to Chicago? Because from what I understand, Chicago is a very different city.
Chicago is very unique. It is.
Very unique, right?
Yeah, it's a very unique city. When I first came to Chicago, it was very different for me because by it being such a large market, Chicago's number 3. And so, I came from Baltimore, which was 21. And so it was very different. And then you also have to remember, too, that this was pre-computers. So we were typing news on typewriters and, we didn't, we had fax machines. We didn't have, you could just email this over. It's like there was none of that. But Chicago's very different in that, it's a very political town. It's a big sports city. News that hits Chicago often ends up being national news. So when I came here, it was a whole different ballpark. It was very different. You have a much larger staff, very similar to, coming from Chicago, you might have, from Baltimore, you may have, a producer and associate producer, but, you come to Chicago and it's like, you've got executive producers, you've got producers, associate producers, assistant producers, you've got writers, you've got all these different people to help you get that show on the air. So when I came, it was like mind blowing. It was like, oh, this is easy. It was like, basically all I have to do is come up with the concept and then I just delegate the work to somebody else. So that was kind of interesting coming into a city like Chicago. Yeah.
And what were some of the big stories that you remember from your time there? Things that like really hit hard. Can you recall?
Yeah.
Chicago specific or even maybe, national news that filtered through Chicago.
Yeah. Wow. Well, clearly a lot of the political news. So we had a lot of politicians that, criminal politicians going to jail. Chicago's known for that. When I first came up, it was during the time of, Michael Jordan and the Bulls, that Bulls dynasty. So that was always big news. And then you had one of the big stories that I remember covering, which I was not familiar with when I came to Chicago, because when you're in Baltimore, it's very local. But in a city as big as Chicago, it's very national. It's nationalized. So when a big story happens someplace else, they actually send reporters there. So I remember covering the Oklahoma City bombing, the Alfred Murrah building in Oklahoma, Timothy McVeigh, actually being there and getting to see that, getting to go cover things like, the Olympics, big sports championships. That was always huge. And then you have things like when you have famous people who pass away, whether it's a presidential death or, celebrities or, very influential people. Many times they have a connection to Chicago. Whenever there's a big national story, and we say it jokingly, but it's really, it's in jest, but there is some truth to it. Whenever there's a big story, it's like, let's find the Chicago connection, because there is always a Chicago connection. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's like, even now, I mean, with the situation and, you've got volcanoes in Spain, we can find people from Chicago, Afghan refugees, trying to get out of Afghanistan.
Right.
There's a Chicago connection. There's a Chicago connection to virtually everything.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, let me point this out. When I moved to New Orleans for law school, and New Orleans is on Central Time, this is when I realized, it's like, you know what? We're missing, like being from the East Coast and sort of having only that experience. Yeah. We're missing a huge portion of what's happening in the United States in terms of just a viewpoint, right? Because Chicago and New Orleans have a relationship as well, sort of in the same, there's a lot of, there is, how do you say, people migrated from New Orleans, Texas, up to Chicago, and then also to California.
Yeah.
So it gave me a more enriched viewpoint in terms of how I could approach certain people, certain stories, et cetera. So I understand. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time in Chicago. I came through, but I felt what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And this was
Chicago
only in the airport.
Yeah.
It was only in the
airport.
Only because it was like TVs everywhere, sports was on everywhere, and there was like food stands or like serious food, not kiosks, but like, centers or something, right?
Yeah.
And some huge game was on, and there was like, people were covering the sports while folks were getting on the plane.
Yeah.
Right. So I thought, this is something interesting. It's interesting.
But yeah, there's something to this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then in terms of your 25 years, what have you seen that's very different now versus when you started? Now, you talked a bit about some of the, there were faxes and then you had typewriters, but in terms of, is there anything else that you can see now that you can give the audience a flavor for?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally changed. First of all, technology has been a huge game changer in the industry. So, it used to be when we had to research a story, we had to be on the phone or we had to go drive somewhere or, the things that we had to do to get information. Now we have a computer. I can Google this or I can fax something. I can email this, we can do interviews like this over Zoom. Whereas, pre-COVID, that was not something that was common, but now it's certainly acceptable. Just the nature of news, because now there are so many different outlets, there are so many different platforms, so many different shows, more news shows are popping up. And so they have more time to fill. So one of the reasons why, I really love what I do is because what I help people to understand is that the news needs them as much as they need the news, because I call it feeding the monster. The minute that show is off the air, you already got to start thinking about your next show. You're already looking ahead to, what am I going to do tomorrow? So it's a constant cycle that never stops. I mean, news is 24/7. You may remember back in the day when, it was, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, they played the national anthem and the TV went black, right? And it's like, now, no, it is 24/7. And so, we work in newsrooms 24/7 because it never stops. You got to keep feeding that monster. So that's a definite change. So the technology has been, it's been a friend, but it's also, been a curse, because it's, when I came to Chicago, the money that I was making was like 3 times what I was making in Baltimore. It was just like, wow, this is great. I'm living the life. This is awesome. But now with the technology, and because, now larger companies are more financially strapped. And so the salaries aren't what they used to be. So we've kind of seen a change there. And then just the nature of the types of stories that we would cover, some things that may not have necessarily even been newsworthy 25 years ago, now we're covering it. It's like right now we're covering this big thing with carjacking crisis. It was like, okay, somebody stole a car. And it's like now, of course, it's gotten more violent. You're putting, everyday people at risk. So the types of stories that we cover are a little bit different. The access that we have to cover those stories is also different. So the technology has been a big help, but it's also made the job a little bit tougher because now you also have digital channels and you have social media. And so as producers and reporters, we're not only required to put on a news broadcast, now we've got to go post it on Twitter. We've got to go put something on Facebook. And it's, it's a lot. So your attention is all over the place.
Yeah, it's time consuming, really, for real. And there's something else that I want you to talk about, like what were your hours, or what are your hours? And so when you first started, say in Baltimore, what were your hours? And then sort of as you graduated to another position in Chicago and sort of so on. Yeah, I know for me, it was I was coming in on the weekends. That was the, how do you call it? That was the shift that people didn't want, especially during the summertime.
Yeah, right. Because who wants to work the weekends in the summer? Yeah, and it used to be, where those were the jobs that the new people got, or the lower ender people got. But it's like now those are actually coveted spots, because that's where the ratings are. Sure. Those are the shows where you really have the greatest opportunity to get more eyeballs on your show. So, people like working the overnight shifts and doing those morning shows. When I produced the morning show, I would go in at 10 at night. So, people are thinking, oh, if I watch the news at 6 or 7 in the morning, they're thinking, I'm coming in at 5 o'clock. It's like, no, I've been there since last night. When that show goes on the air, that is the end of my shift, not the beginning.
Right. So, right.
Yeah, I've done all kinds of shifts.
It's interesting because when I worked at MSNBC, I never worked a full week shift. That was for sort of the high level people. And then I knew something was up when all of a sudden I got the weekend shift. And it was the summertime. But that was when the news was getting good, particularly around July, August, right before Labor Day.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So we booked Harry Belafonte through some crazy connection at 8 in the morning on a Sunday. And the person pitched Harry Belafonte to us. And because I knew the significance of it, I literally pushed that story forward. And I knew at that moment, despite him being Harry Belafonte, if I had not been there as sort of the guy representing diversity, no, they didn't officially call it that. And they weren't even looking for it. I was just there. I recognized, I'm like, we need to have him on at 8 in the morning. And when he came, everybody was, when I say ready, we were ready for him, right? Yeah. You could feel the energy. 8 in the morning was like, oh man, Harry Belafonte's coming on. And then the crew was singing like Deo or something like that, like before he.
Yeah.
So I mean, like we bonded over, things like that.
Yeah.
And when they got the ratings back, just as you said, our ratings started to get consistently higher on the weekends, and they couldn't understand why, because they felt that the weekday was supposed to be the higher ratings. Yeah. Because that's where everything's happening during the week, right?
Yeah. But it's almost like the weekend, you almost feel like they give you space to experiment. So it's like, okay, it's like, it's just the weekends. If you want to try it, go ahead and try it. And it's like, okay, it could work or it could bomb, but and you find that it works, and that was one of the great things that I loved when I was with ABC. One of the shows that I produced, I probably did 20 years, probably about 15 years. On the midday show, and I produced the midday show, and it was an hour-long show. It started as a half hour. It was doing so great, we expanded it to an hour, and I loved it because it was so long. It gave us the space to actually get the news in, but we also had room to do some fun. So we would have a lot of fun guest segments. So you talk about Harry Belafonte. It was like, we had Patti LaBelle, Will Smith, Shaka Khan. Right. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And, and just the memories of being able to do that. That was one of my favorite parts of my job.
Yeah. I mean, like that's the time. I mean, because you're so busy, you're in the grind of moving through the day, right?
Yeah.
I think that people weren't even mindful that the weekend was going to be that fruitful. You understand what I'm saying? All they wanted to do is one of our colleagues pointed out, was go to the Hamptons. That's all they wanted to do, is go to Hamptons. So there was room. They weren't thinking about whether it didn't matter whether it was Harry Belafonte. It was like they had already closed the door in terms of, but then what happened is that we really started to get creative. We really, so, that is what it is. But I mean, like yourself, I got to a point where, I had to leave, right? And I want you to tell the audience, that there was a time in this process that you actually left the business.
Yeah.
But you did some really interesting things as well. I mean, like you really, and I'll let you tell.
Yeah, I did leave the business, because first of all, it's a very grueling business. We talked about the crazy hours, working holidays. I mean, I didn't get to spend, I think the first time I had a Thanksgiving off was, probably about maybe 5 years ago. I worked every Thanksgiving. I was working for a while there. I'd be working Christmas, Easter, all the major holidays. You're working weekends, you're working overnights and all this madness. And back in 2013, the ABC station that I was with was going through a major transition. And so they had a new general manager. Mm-hmm. And so the old general manager, before she left, she had bought a daytime talk show. Kelly, it was, back then it was Live with Kelly Ripa and Michael Strahan. And so when she left, she had bought the show, but didn't have any idea where she was going to put it. Mm-hmm. And so when we heard about that, it was like, okay, some major changes are going to happen. And so I'm starting to think, I'm like, you know what? Something's telling me that they're going to put this show in our time slot. And lo and behold, the new GM comes in and he decides that, he's going to move some things around and get rid of the midday news. And it's like, how are you in Chicago getting rid of the #1 newscast in the 3rd largest market? And so at that time I had a decision to make. It was, do I leave the station? Do I leave the business? Or do I, kind of filter in and go someplace else? Mm-hmm. And at that time, my oldest son was getting ready to start high school. I have 3 sons. And so my husband and I had talked about it, and we were like, this might be a good time for you to just kind of take a break. You're burned out anyway. And that was also a lesson that I learned, because I had spent probably about a good year to a year and a half kind of going back and forth. Is it time for me to leave? Maybe it's just time to go. I'm burned out. I'm tired. I just, my heart wasn't in it anymore. And so then when it was like, oh, we're canceling your show, it was like, oh, well, there's the answer I've been looking for. So I walked away, I stepped away from news. And we had a cultural center at that time. So I was pretty much working at the cultural center, doing the things that I love. We had dance programs. We were teaching African dance. We had yoga classes, movie screenings. We have a banquet hall where people can come and book weddings.
Wait. So back up. You organized a cultural center. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. My husband and I, we started it. Yeah. And it basically focuses on African and African-American culture. Because we got married in Kenya. Okay. And so when we came back, I wanted to find a way to just kind of, still be engulfed, every day, to be immersed in that culture and bring that back to Chicago. And so, we started this cultural center to help do that. So when I left television, then it left me open to be able to do that full time. And after about like 3 years, literally one day, one of the reporters from one of the competing stations walked in. She walked through the doors and she's just like, we need you. I need your help. Our station is in trouble. Our ratings are low. I know you're not in TV anymore, but would you consider coming back? And I was like, no, I'm done with TV. I don't want to come back. I really love this. This is what I want to do. But she was a really good friend and highly respected in the industry. And so I decided that I would come back. And I figured if I'm going to come back, I wanted to come back on my terms. So I came back, as a producer and a writer, and now for the CBS station.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, when we had our pre-interview, you talked about how you, in this cultural center, I just think it's very interesting that, how did you, first of all, I got so many questions. Because you worked almost every Thanksgiving, who prepared Thanksgiving, or how did that get done in your house?
That was me. I did it all. You want to know what Superwoman looks like? This is her. So I would work because I would go to work at like 3 a.m. and then I would go work, produce my show. I would put on my show 11 o'clock. I'd be home by 12 o'clock. And then it was like, okay, now we prepare Thanksgiving dinner. So, after working all day, now I come home and I got to, cook turkey, dressing, all the trimmings. Cause, I wanted to make sure family's always been important to me too. And I wanted to make sure that no matter what, regardless of what I did in my career, I never wanted my kids to feel like they were missing out on something. Mm-hmm. And so I did that too. I did the whole big Thanksgiving spread. And then after, having dinner, it was time to go to bed and get back up and be back in the station at 3 a.m. again.
And so there's another question. When you started the community center, at what year? Give us a year, the year
we actually opened it we opened our first. Well, before it was a community center, it was actually just a retail store. So we got married in 96, and then we opened our first shop in 99. Oh my God. And so it started, it was just like it was about 1,000 square feet. And we had developed relationships with people back in Kenya and Tanzania. And so we were importing things from all these different African countries, stuff from Nigeria and Ghana, Senegal. And we just had this retail shop, about 1,000 square feet, where people would, could kind of come in and buy African clothes and art and, your shea butters, your incense, your oils, all of that. And then there was a space it was an apartment. It was like a store on the first floor, but an apartment on the second floor. And it was right across the street from our center. Mm-hmm. And what actually happened is one day I'm, just sitting in the store and I'm watching and I'm seeing people like going up to the door, they make a little transaction, they would leave. And I'm like, I think they're selling drugs out of that building. So I told my husband, I'm like, come here, watch this. And we're watching. He's like, yeah. So come to find out, the building was a crack house. And so what we ended up doing, the person who lived there ended up losing the building. Wow. So we ended up buying it. So we bought that building, and that was about twice the size of the space that we had. So we moved our store across the street to this bigger space. And so now we not only had space for the retail store, but we also had like a little studio. So we had a little dance studio. Okay. So then that's when we started doing the dance classes and all of that.
Who was organizing this?
That was me. I know. And every time I would come up with these ideas, my husband's like, "Are you crazy? How are you gonna do all this?" I'm like, "Don't worry about it. We got this." So
and what was his working situation like? I mean, so
he was a general contractor.
Okay.
For part of this time, he was a general contractor, and then he got a job working as community of external affairs at a charter school.
Okay.
So he was doing that during the day. And then, in the evening, we were doing poetry slams and, we were doing just all kinds of fun stuff. We would have drum circles. So it was like
definitely doing the most. But I mean, the same skill set that you employ as a producer is the same. It's the same. Right, you're pulling elements together. You're constantly pulling things together, getting people to come together, making sure that the timing, like project management, that's what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's exactly what it is. It's project management and the importance of building a team. So, I wasn't doing all this by myself. By this time we had 3 sons who were, at that time they were probably maybe like 3, 5, and 7. So, they were active in it. They literally grew up in the business.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is your husband from Chicago or is not?
He is from Chicago.
Okay, so that even makes it better, right? So you're not there, like you have the support of his, the fact that he's from there and his family or his ties.
Right.
Actually,
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, why is he put all this? It is quite amazing. And another thing you're talking about, you had this kente cloth ties, like you were selling kente cloth ties and other types of garments and stuff. People were really interested.
Oh yeah, they were well, because when I first got into, I had my business, I was kind of keeping it hush hush. It was like, well, I didn't want, people at the station to know that I had this other business and this other stuff going on. Even though, it was no conflict or anything like that. I just figured it was none of their business. And eventually I was just like, well, wait, I can actually use this. And so I would bring stuff from my store and I would literally bring it into the station. You'd come by my desk and it was like, my desk, I have kente cloth clothes and shea butter. And, I was selling jewelry to every anchor in town. All the female anchors were wearing my jewelry that I sold. All the male anchors were wearing neckties, kente cloth neckties. So it was like, I didn't care anymore. I was like, okay, they're going to know what I do because I do it and I'm loud and proud about it. And that's why it was thriving.
And so it's still in existence and you're still doing that. And do you call up the people in Kenya and say, we need more earrings or we need more kente cloth ties or what?
Yeah. Well,
how does this work?
Well, now the concept for the sitter has evolved. So now we went from about 2,000 square feet. Now we've got 14,000 square feet. And so in the center, it's not even so much focused on the products, but it's really more focused on the events. And, we do classes, dance classes, there's movie screenings, we do weddings and birthday parties and all that kind of stuff, which, COVID kind of.
Sure.
Yeah, last year it was kind of rough because COVID kind of put a pause on some things, which is probably good because I think we needed to take a pause.
You're doing a lot. You're doing a lot.
It was a lot.
Well, look, I think it's amazing, right? And I get very excited when I hear these kinds of things because being an entrepreneur is a creative endeavor. Right. Yeah. It takes a lot of creativity. And I think, it's the reason why you and I are having a conversation and why the channel, why I created the channel, because I felt that someone like you, there is this multifaceted thing happening, right? And people don't necessarily know.
Right.
When you put that on the CV, what that means, right? Or what it really entails. They're supposed to know. HR is supposed to know. The people that do hiring, let's say in the news, they're supposed to kind of parse through. But now I guess what they do is, and this is what I saw one of these little videos on TikTok. One of the reasons why people aren't getting their resume through is that you have to have the same words in your resume.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because it's all the algorithms and the keywords and it's all, it's a computer. So you're really losing that, that key human connection that we have. And, and a computer doesn't really understand how skills are transferable. Right. They're just looking for certain keywords to push your resume, up the chain.
It's amazing. And so let's say when you returned to news, was there anything different your second time around versus your first go?
Not really. I mean, because I was out for about 3 years. And people always ask me, did I miss it? And the answer is no. I didn't miss it. Just because it's so grueling and it's so, it's like you're just compelled to watch it. So even for a while there, I didn't even watch news because it would just pull me in. I'd be watching TV and I'd be yelling at the TV screen. It's like, calm down. It's not that serious. But it wasn't really different. When I came back, it was almost just like, okay, like riding a bike. You just right where you left off. It's because it's forever evolving.
Yeah, but I think one of the things, what I'm sensing is that when you're in the news and you're processing it, this is how I experienced it. You start to live it out. It's like part of your body, right? It's an extension of who you are. So even when you're watching other people's news programs, you have an opinion, you have something to say, and or when it's going off the rail or if something isn't done right. And I want to return to the consulting business that you put together, and what I sense. Part of what I think you know how to do is, let's say, because you've had years of experience and you see a breaking news story, it's almost like you can reverse engineer the story based on maybe what's in the story, what's not in the story.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
you can compare the way one station covered it versus the way that you covered it.
Oh yeah, I still do that.
Yeah.
I do that all the time, and I'll sit down and be like, well, why didn't you do this, or why did they put there? And I'll be like, oh, something must have happened, because clearly that wasn't supposed to go there, and they were supposed to do that. Oh, they meant to do that, but and so you kind of, having been in it and been in that situation in the control room, and everything doesn't always go perfect every time, but your ultimate goal as a producer is to make sure even when things don't go right, the audience should never know. But of course, as a producer, Right.
Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and I want to know how you would approach this crisis situation or this news story. So one of the stories that I thought was very interesting, rather, was the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. So quite recently, I mean, every time you look at the news, there's always something going on with them. And are they going to stay in the UK? And then they came to the United States and they moved to California. Did you happen to watch the interview or know of the interview with Oprah when, right? How would you have handled that situation, let's say, in terms of, because they were in a crisis, right? In terms of the wedding, and in terms of like the father, in terms of like, how would you approach that situation? Is there anything that you would, if you had the ability to get that story on air?
In terms of, you're saying, how would I tell Meghan and Harry, how would I tell Harry and Meghan to handle their crisis?
You could say like this: how would you approach it as a story? And then let's say if Harry and Meghan came to you and said, we need help with the crises, would you recommend Oprah or not Oprah? And if so, Oprah, what would you ask or advise them to do?
I honestly, I think that the way they handled it was beautifully. I would say, always Oprah. If and when, absolutely. If and when and because Oprah and Harry, do have that relationship, he has that kind of access. Everybody doesn't have that access, but because you do, absolutely, you want to use it. And that is why Harry and Meghan came out. I mean, yeah, they had some critics. And you're always going to have critics. That's the thing you got to recognize. I don't care what you do, you're always going to have critics. But I think that the reason they came out smelling like a rose is because they had Oprah in their corner. And of course, as a journalist, you're supposed to be unbiased and fair and, accurate, of course, above all else. But the truth of the matter is, Oprah and Harry, they have a relationship, they're friends. And so when Oprah opens her door and her platform, her very home to you, how do you not take it?
Yeah, that's a good point.
What are you gonna say? Oh no, Oprah, I'm not gonna talk to you. Come on.
And you don't necessarily see it as a crisis of a monumental proportion, at least in the United States. In the UK,
I think that it was. Yeah, I think that it was, but I think that because of the way they handled it, the fact that they did sit down and talk about it, I'll tell even most of my clients, they'll think that, oh, well, it'll just die down, leave it alone. It's like, no, you give them what they want. You get to put your own spin on it. Prime example, you probably know about this whole story with Alec Baldwin. He accidentally, shot one of the director on the set. Well, the paparazzi, of course, everybody wants to hear from Alec Baldwin. We want to hear his side of the story. We've heard all the analysts. We heard, all the experts. We want to hear his story. And so the paparazzi were following him. He and his family are traveling in Vermont. So they've left Santa Fe, they're in Vermont, and paparazzi are following him. And he finally literally got out of the car, pulled over on the side of the highway and said, hey, look, I'm going to talk to you guys. Then you can just leave me alone. You give them a bone. I mean, otherwise, everywhere you go, they're going to be following you. But if you just give them what they want, and he even said that, he said, look, my kids are in the car crying because you're following us everywhere we go. There's cameras. I'm going to talk to you guys. I'm going to tell you what I can tell you because it is an investigation. I can only say so much. but I'm going to give you the soundbite that you want. Now just leave us alone. Mm-hmm. And Harry and Meghan did the same thing. It was like everybody, is rumbling about, oh, they're going to leave the royal family. Are they going to move to the US? Are they going to do this? Oh my gosh, wait, what if this happens? Well, it's because she's Black. And, well, who was the person who asked about the baby's skin color? It's like, you know what, let's put it out there. Let's get in front of it. You have to be strategic in how you do it, but get in front of it, and then it will blow over much faster. Okay, so when someone like an R. Kelly decided to do an interview with Gayle King, right? Oh yeah, that was a debacle. What is your take on that, and why do you think that interview happened, and what would you have recommended in his situation? I think he was in a crisis. He was in a huge crisis, right? He was in a huge crisis, but the way he handled it, it wasn't even the fact that he did the interview. I didn't have any problems with him doing the interview, but again, it was the way he did the interview. It was, I watched that interview and I almost laughed because I was like, clearly we know who's running this shop. He didn't have any professionals on his side saying, look, right. This is, what you say, this is how you say it, and the whole thing blew up in his face. I think one of his boys was like, all right, let's do the interview. That's how it went down. Because it went left pretty quickly, right? Yeah, very quickly. Yeah. I mean, and it's not just a matter of just sitting down and doing an interview, but it has to be very strategic and it has to be mapped out if it's going to work in your favor. And for him, I don't think it did. When you do a strategic session or map it out, like what is a map out? Like if I say, okay, do you think, okay, so this is what the narrative is nationally, or this is the narrative that is happening globally with your situation. And I recommend that you first do this, second do that. I mean, how does it work? Yeah, I mean, it is kind of like that, but you kind of figure out, obviously no journalist is going to give you questions and say, oh, here are the questions I'm going to ask you. That doesn't happen. And sometimes people will do that. They'll say, well, I'll only do an interview if you ask me these questions. Like, no, that crosses the line of integrity. I'm not going to do that. You can't tell me what I can and cannot ask. But what you can do is you can formulate answers to those questions that you think most likely they're going to ask. Mm-hmm. And have questions, not trying to, just kind of go off the cuff, but you have to have answers that are formulated. You have to know, and you have to stick to it. I mean, a lot of times I can watch interviews and, when it starts going left, exactly. I'm like, you weren't supposed to say that. I can clearly tell you were not supposed to say that. Right. I understand. I'll give you one last one. I know we're using pop culture, but I mean, this is fun. The interview with Jada Pinkett Smith and Will Smith, the Red Table Talk. Did you happen to see that? This one, I mean, it was epic. I would say this, that couple is really pushing the boundaries of what is, I don't want to use the word acceptable, but within the Black community, sort of the topics that they are covering are really on the edge, right? Yeah, and part of, and again, you have to remember, even with Will and Jada, everything that they do is strategic. Right. That Red Table Talk wasn't something they just said, oh, let's just go sit down at the red table and have a conversation. No, that was, there was strategy behind that. There was absolutely strategy behind that. And it worked. I mean, I think that, there was some parts of it where it was like, you're an actor. You could have done a better job with that. But but I think overall, they did exactly what, I always tell my clients to do. Get in front of it. People are talking about it. People are whispering about it. People are forming opinions about it. So answer the questions. And do you think they actually came out looking good at the end of the interview, or what's your take on it? With that one, I think they came out looking better, because I just think that a lot of people after that, people could just kind of like take a sigh, because I was like, oh, that's kind of what I thought. And of course, a lot of people, even at that point, were like, well, everybody's talking about what Jada did. Nobody's talking about what Will did, which he, addressed later. But a lot of times with celebrities, it is what it is. People, you're in the public eye, you're well known, you're celebrities, you have all this fame, you have all this money. People are going to talk, period. People are always going to talk. And so, if you are team Will and Jada and you love them, or if you're anti Will and Jada, you're going to have people on both sides. But I think for them, it was definitely in their best interest to just get out in front of it. And, again, that was strategic because the viewership of the Red Table Talk had been slipping.
Yeah.
And so that was obviously one of the highest rated episodes, because when they said, oh, we're going to sit down at the red table and talk about this, everybody was tuning in, even people who hadn't even kept up with, the rumors and what was going on, and so, the viewership of that one went through the roof. And now, they've gotten eyeballs back on their brand. So now Red Table Talk is profitable again. So it worked. It did exactly what they wanted it to do.
It's very interesting. Well, I'm not going to hold you much longer. I want to ask you a couple more questions. How would you characterize your journey, your career journey?
It's kind of been like a zigzag, which actually, I look at it now and it's good. When I first got into this business, I was thinking, well, I want to be a news director. Well, originally, actually, when I was in college and I decided that I wanted to switch, because I was pre-med. I don't know if you remember, I was actually pre-med.
No.
Yeah, I was pre-med. And when I think it was sophomore year, when I actually discovered that I really was a creative being. One of the things that I even tell my kids about college, I'm like, college, sometimes it's not about what you learn, it's who you learn. And the most important who you need to learn is yourself.
Right.
And that's what college did for me. I learned so much about myself. I noticed that, that's when I discovered that I really liked to write, that I was, creative being. And I was just like, I don't know if this whole math and science thing, as much as I liked it and I was good at it, it was like, I don't know if that's really what I want to do. So when I decided to go to journalism, I switched my major my sophomore year. And so my whole plan was to be a reporter. And when I got into my first newsroom in Philly, and I was kind of watching how things work, as an intern, you get to see a lot of stuff. And I was just like, oh, so the people who have the power, the decision makers, are not the people that you see on TV. It's the folks behind the scenes.
Sure.
That's what I decided. I was like, that's what I want to do. I don't want to be a reporter. I want to be a producer. I want to be the one who's making the decisions, calling the shots, who actually have the power to have more of an impact. So that's why I decided to be a producer. And so my ultimate goal was, I'm going to be a news director, or I'm going to be a general manager and be able to impact all these lives and, be able to really control the narrative, particularly the narrative about Black people, because, at that time, this is when crazy stuff was happening, the whole thing with darkening of OJ's face and a lot of underlying things, that were happening with minorities in the media. And it was just like, oh, I get to actually change that. I can actually, impact what's really happening. And so as I got, particularly when I came to Chicago, I think it was like my star was shooting so fast. And it was just like, this is exhausting. At first it was like, this is fun. I'm loving this. I get to, do all this stuff. I'm in this big city. I get to live this life. I get to meet all these people. But after about a few years, I was like, this is really exhausting, because you never really do get to turn it off. It's, you're either in it or you're not. And when you're really dedicated to it, it's a 24/7 job. So yeah, I was at work, but then I would come home and I was still at work.
Sure.
And so, eventually I just decided that I just wanted to pull back and focus on some other things. And so that's why I kind of pivoted and went more towards the media and the PR.
And what advice would you give to somebody who is starting out now in the in journalism or in the business?
I would just say research, be well aware of what you're getting into. Because one of the things that I didn't mention is that I'm also a college professor. So
no, I didn't mention that. we didn't talk about that. Where are you? Can you mention where you teach?
Yeah, I teach at Columbia College here in Chicago. And so I teach TV news reporting and writing.
Okay. And
so, one of the things that I always tell, I tell my kids, when you really are good at your craft, you can go anywhere. So, most of them who come and say, oh yeah, I want to be a reporter. I want to be a reporter. It's like, and that's great. that's awesome. But even if you don't, these are skills that you can use no matter what you decide to be. They're transferable. The stuff that you're going to learn in my class is stuff that you will be able to take, whether you decide to become an accountant, you could be a swim instructor, you might want to be, develop an app and be some kind of tech giant, or, be an expert in AI. These are skills that are going to serve you well.
Yeah. Well, is there any final words that you want to impart on us? I mean, you've said a lot. I mean, there's a lot. You've done a lot. And this is the thing, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, we've had several opportunities to connect because we do the reunions, and I see you a lot. We've never had this much time to have a conversation about what you've been doing for the last 25, 30 years.
Yeah. And It is a lot. And even when I look at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I look at some of the stuff now and I'm like, how did I do all that? I'm like, oh my gosh, it is a lot. But when you love it, you make time for it. It's, and that's just kind of how I've been. And I have the freedom to do it now because now my kids are older. So my youngest son just graduated high school. So I've got 2 in college, one who's just recently out of college. So I'm like, I've been there, done that. So now I get to do me and focus on me and the things that I really want and the things that I really like. So I'm really putting more focus and energy into my business because I know that Stay Ready Media has the power to help people. There's so many people who have stories that need to be told. There's so many people who have messages that they need to share, but people don't know that they exist. And it's like, I really help you put a megaphone to your message to get out there, to understand how to work the landscape of the media. Because a lot of people think, oh, well, you either have to be rich or, you have to be famous, or you have to have a huge following or, all these things. And it's like, no, you really don't. You absolutely do not. And so I help them to be able to formulate those messages and really find their way into mass media, because mass media is not going anywhere.
No.
Of course you have new media, which is awesome. And I use it too, but being able to integrate that with, the traditional mass media is, it's genius and it's brilliant. And it's helping so many people to grow their businesses, their brand, really share their voice. And that's how you make a greater impact in the world.
I'm going to ask you 2 more questions. So you covered, because it just came to my head. So you covered OJ. You were fortunate enough to be in the news at the time when that story broke, right? What year was that? You were in Chicago at the time.
94. I was actually in Baltimore. So that would have been 90. That was 94.
And did the Rodney King thing happen when we were in school? Was that
Rodney King? No, Rodney King was, because I was working in Baltimore at the time that happened too. So that would have been, that was like 93, I think. Yeah, I think that would have been around 92 or 93.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, and I'll throw this out, I mean, now I'm like throwing balls at the wall. All of the social justice that we are seeing in the generations that are coming up after us, not when we were around, after. Right. It's just interesting to see how all of that is being processed, considering what we saw when we were coming up through school. And I would even say this, when we compare our experiences to our parents' experiences or even our grandparents, one could argue that we didn't really experience racial discrimination in the way that they did. But right. we definitely had our own series of challenges. And I think it's great that you and I could have this conversation today, because I think part of the reason why we went through what we went through, and even why we're here now having the conversation, has to do with this history and what we experienced. And it was on a high, it wasn't like, water hoses and all of that. Right. Yeah. But we were really, I felt we were walking a serious tightrope.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that, you know, you have to remember that everybody's experience is different. And so when we look at our experience, or we look at the experience of those who came before us, it's all about educating. And this is why I think that history is so important, because, you know, those saying you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And that can relate to anything, whether you're talking about issues of race. I see, you know, like we look at now, like the whole Me Too movement, that probably couldn't have happened 20 years ago. You know, it couldn't have happened 20 years ago. Even when you look at instances like now, you have a lot more people who are speaking out about, you know, domestic violence and abuse. And it's like what we look at as abuse 20 years ago, they would have been like, oh, that ain't abuse. I mean, that's just, you know, but again, it's all as we begin to share our experiences, you know, and it's eye-opening. And the media has been a huge vehicle in doing that, whether it's in news or whether it's in, you know, scripted or, you know, episodic dramas, and, you know, in some cases, even comedies, you know, can make fun of those types of things, so that you can relate to people. And that's why I think that media is so important across the board, because it helps us to learn it, and it opens our eyes to new experiences. There was, what was the show? I think Made I think it was on Netflix, but I was watching an episode of that, and it, you know, the whole basis of that is about emotional abuse. And her thing was, well, I'm not abused, you know, and from her perspective, she wasn't abused. It was like, oh, you know, he might have been a little rough. Maybe he didn't treat her right, but it wasn't abuse. And then when she gets to compare her experience to the experience of other people, it's like, it's eye-opening. It's like, wow, okay, yeah, it was abuse. No, he wasn't, you know, slapping me upside my face every day, but this was abuse. And the same thing can happen with racial issues. People will look at it and be like, well, that's not racism. That's not racist. You know, what he meant by that was this, and he said that. And it's like, and that's why conversations are so important. You know, it opens our eyes to so many things that are going on. And then we begin to see the world differently. And then we begin to act in the world differently. And then those actions transfer to other people, to those younger generations. So we see 20 years from now, you know, I hope and pray, and I do believe we're going to see a completely different world, because, you know, our experiences blended with their experiences, it's going to change the world.
Yeah, I think it already has. I mean, I'll throw one last thing at you. Quite recently, Dave Chappelle dropped his special on Netflix, and I just want to get your opinion on that. I will share what I believe is interesting about the whole thing, is that just when I think African-American Black people in the United States feel like maybe there's a shift in a positive direction where we have a little more leverage just in terms of living, there's another issue that comes out of left field where someone like a Dave Chappelle didn't necessarily think would this subject matter would be an issue. I just think it's fascinating, and I think it's positive that there is dialogue around it. Now, how and where it will go, that's another issue altogether. But the very fact that it's even in the news and the way that it's being covered and how he's being covered, I think is interesting.
Yeah. And again, that's something that, you know, probably wouldn't have been covered in the same way, you know, 20 years ago had that happened. And that's why conversations are so important. So I just say, if nothing else, it has opened the doors to a conversation. And people tend to think, you know, conversation means I come to the table with my opinion, you come to the table with your opinion, and, you know, we just sit. No, that's not a conversation. You know, we're always trying to figure out what we're going to say before the other person has even finished saying what they're going to say. You know, you've already started, you know, formulating your defense. It's like, no, sometimes you need to just shut up and listen. You know,
I hear you.
And being, you know, trying to put yourself in that other person's shoes, you know, that's how we affect change.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I'm going to let that be the last word. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this interview. I mean, I've learned a heck of a lot more about you in the last hour or so than I did when I was in school. which is, the point, right? And it's my hope as we put this together, upload it and share it, that other people in our university community and outside of that community as well will take note to your final words, because I think it's really important that we have a dialogue and conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Stacia, it was great speaking with you. And I will. Stranger. I know. Hey, look, while I'm on social media, you can anytime you want to see what I'm up to, all you got to do is go to the page and it's there,
Right, absolutely. Okay. And if anybody who's looking for any PR, media, or just want to, have more conversation about how their story might be good for getting on TV, radio, or podcast, just hit me up, stayreadymedia.com.
Yeah, and we'll put that in the description box and ways that you can communicate and contact Stacia.
Awesome.
Thank you.
That was fun. Thank you.
Right. Have a good rest of your day or your evening. I will. And we'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
All right.